Chapter 35, Section 3, continued. Let's talk about the end of the Cold War. Under Gorbachev, the Soviet Union was changing. They're even going to hold their first democratic elections since 1917. And the economic reforms that Gorbachev is trying to put into place, they weren't working. Part of the reason was Reagan. Reagan's spending on defense systems basically caused the Soviet Union to try to increase their defense spending. The problem was, economically, the Soviet Union had a lot bigger issues they needed to be dealing with. And in July of '89, Gorbachev is going to announce that the Soviet Union will be leaving the satellite nations alone. Simple reason why. They couldn't afford to help them anymore. So in places like Poland and Hungary, you're going to see free elections. In places like Czechoslovakia and Romania, their communist governments fell. And by the fall of '89, you're going to see pro-democracy demonstrations in East Germany. Thousands of East Germans were fleeing. They would go to Hungary. Remember, Hungary was holding free elections. They'd go to Hungary, and from there they could leave and go to the West. In October, the communist leader of East Germany, Erich Honecker, resigns. And on November 9th of 1989, the Berlin Wall opens. Huge celebrations at the Berlin Wall. And now you're starting to see pressure to reunite Germany. October 3rd, 1990, Germany is going to be reunited as the Federal Republic of Germany. As you get into '91, there's going to be more problems with the Soviet Union. Die-hard communists are going to try to overthrow Gorbachev. It fails, but you can see the division within the Soviet Union. And on December 1st, the Ukraine votes for independence. On December 25th of '91, Gorbachev resigns as president of the Soviet Union, and control of the Soviet Union's armed forces are going to be turned over to Boris Yeltsin, president of Russia. The next day, the leaders of Belarus, the Ukraine, and Russia announce that the Soviet Union no longer exists. Those republics of the Soviet Union, your Russias, your Kazakhstan, your Ukraine, your Belarus, your Lithuania, your Estonia, your Latvia, all of those republics are now their own countries. There is no more Soviet Union. Those countries are going to actually form a loose confederation called the Commonwealth of Independent States. They were their own countries, but they kind of agreed to work together. A lot of their stuff was integrated from when they were the Soviet Union at one point in time. So communism, though, wasn't completely gone. China is still communist. But in May of '89, you started seeing pro-democracy demonstrations in China. And in June, in Tiananmen Square, there are going to be demonstrators, pro-democracy demonstrators, that are going to, their rebellion is going to be crushed by the government. The government sent in tanks and soldiers to crush this rebellion. This is probably one of the most iconic pictures from this. Still don't know who the guy is, but he stepped in the way of the column of tanks, and surprisingly, they didn't run him over. He gets away, but there were people killed, estimated between a few hundred to over 1,000, depending on the sources you seek. All right, let's talk Persian Gulf War. Persian Gulf War. President George H.W. Bush, Herbert Walker Bush, he wants to make the U.S. a leader in the world again. And something's going to happen in August of 1990 that's going to give him an opportunity. In August of 1990, Iraq had invaded Kuwait. The leader of Iraq was Saddam Hussein. And Saddam Hussein was mad at Kuwait because he said their oil production was hurting Iraq. He said Kuwait was producing too much oil. And if you have a surplus, that means the price of oil is going to go down, which means these oil-producing countries won't make enough money. Iraq needed money. They were in debt. 80 to $100 billion in debt from a war they had fought against Iran. We didn't act real concerned about the whole thing at first, so Saddam wasn't necessarily concerned about us. The UN condemns the attack and imposes economic sanctions on Iraq and sets a deadline for Iraq to get their troops out of Kuwait. January 16th actually is going to be the deadline. And you're going to see the UN begin what's called Operation Desert Shield. The purpose of a shield is to protect. Operation Desert Shield was to protect Saudi Arabia from being invaded. The concern was Iraq would then move into Saudi Arabia to try to halt their oil production. So by the time you get to January 15th of 1991, the final day before the deadline, you've got a multinational force that is gathered in Saudi Arabia and in the Gulf. It's not just us. We're there obviously. Great Britain, France, Egypt, Saudi Arabia. All in all, there's 690,000 troops. Now, most of those were ours because out of those countries, we were by far the strongest. The deadline comes, and Operation Desert Shield is going to convert to Operation Desert Storm. Iraq did not withdraw their troops from Kuwait, so on January 16th, we begin bombing Iraq. And by we, I mean the UN. Obviously, we're going to be a major part of this. It wasn't just us. On February 23rd, the ground assault is going to begin. Our troops are going to be led by General Norman Schwarzkopf. Norman. He was the commander of our troops in the First Gulf War, the Persian Gulf War. And literally within days, the Iraqis are driven back. This is a picture of the highway leading out of Kuwait to Iraq. It becomes nicknamed the Highway of Death. Iraq is going to launch SCUD missiles into Israel and Saudi Arabia. But the fighting in Iraq, The fighting in the Gulf War, the ground fight, is going to last 100 hours. So 100 hours after the fighting begins, a ceasefire is declared. Because the goal of this operation was to push the Iraqis out of Kuwait. That was accomplished. Now, a decade later, you end up with the question of should they have gone ahead and taken out Saddam at that time? And it could have saved some mess later on. But at the time, hindsight, at the time in 91, who knew that was going to happen? You know, a decade later. U.S. casualties, 150 killed, 450 wounded. The number of Iraqis killed, it's estimated to be around 100,000. And you have several cities, like Baghdad, the capital, that are severely damaged. But after this war in Iraq, after the Gulf War, Bush's approval rating, the 90%. I mean, he handled this fantastic. Huge praise for Bush. Huge praise for Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney, for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Colin Powell. This war was a very unique war. It was unlike anything we'd ever seen before. This war was won almost entirely by high-tech weapons. You know, we had these things called Tomahawk cruise missiles, which we could launch from hundreds of miles away, and they were extremely accurate. I remember seeing, video of them shooting them in through open doors of buildings. They're very accurate. You had stealth aircraft that were undetectable by radar. Second thing that caused this to be such a unique war. Soldiers relied on handheld global positioning systems, or GPS. GPS seems to be everywhere now. But it was developed by the Department of Defense. And if our soldiers were going to be out here in the middle of a desert, they needed to be able to figure out where they were and where they needed to go. Third thing, unprecedented coverage by reporters. You had live coverage of air assaults. This is the war that put CNN on the map, this struggling news network. But they were in Iraq. They were in Baghdad when we started to bomb it, to report on it. And another reason this is going to be such a unique war was women played a huge role. 35,000 women served. I mean, that was 6% of our troops there. And they weren't just in these, non-hazardous positions. There were 11 killed. There were 2 taken POW. They did not serve as combat pilots. That restriction wasn't lifted until after this war by the Senate. But there still were some restrictions after that on some of the ground battle positions they could be in. So this war went perfect. It went as you could draw something up. But Bush is going to start getting some criticism after the war because he was neglecting problems here in the U.S. and some of his support after the war starts to weaken. And the main concern people had was the economy. In August of '89, the savings and loans and banks had to get a bailout from Congress. In late '90, you got a recession hit. You've got a need to balance the budget. A number of problems were occurring here. And then Bush is going to have to break a campaign promise that he made during the '88 campaign, when Bush said, "Read my lips, no new taxes." With the economic problems we were going through, we needed a tax increase. But the thing is, it did very little to actually help. And so he breaks his campaign promise, raises our taxes, and it doesn't really reduce the deficit. In 91, we were spending 270 billion more than we were making. In 92, that number went even higher. And then on top of that, you've got an international trade deficit. We were importing way more than we were exporting. Just in the year 1990, we imported 102 billion more than we exported. That is not good for your economy. Massive amounts of this in the 90s was coming from Japan. Unemployment rate was growing as the economy fell apart. Money issues, some states have to cut their welfare programs. And this recession was continuing into 92, which is going to be an election year. And this is going to hurt Bush's re-election chances.